Lingo Nest, learning advanced English.
Welcome, welcome everyone. If you've been scrolling through the news lately, I'm sure you've seen it. That phrase, Iran-Israel war, just splashed everywhere.
It really jumps out at you, doesn't it? It's pretty unsettling stuff.
Totally. It immediately brings up these images of, intense conflict, instability. It feels like the world's on a bit of a knife edge.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, I think it creates this real sense of unease. You feel kind of exposed to these big global conflicts, even if they seem far away.
Exactly. They feel distant, but the ripples, they definitely reach us, don't they?
Yeah.
Affecting everything from, I don't know, gas prices to just the general feeling of global security.
And the information just comes at you like a tidal wave. It's a complex, things change fast, there's so many different players involved. It's easy to feel overwhelmed.
That is precisely why we're here today. Our mission, really, with this deep dive is to help cut through all that noise. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding what's really going on between Iran and Israel right now.
We've gone through a whole stack of different sources.
We really have. We've got the big 2025 worldwide threat assessment from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA. We've got critical updates, battlefield details from the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW.
Plus some historical context, looking back using sources like Wikipedia, and then some really insightful analysis from places like the Atlantic Council and ACAM Asset Management. A real mix.
Yeah, a good mix. And from all of that, we've tried to pull out the most important bits, the key nuggets of knowledge. The goal is to give you a clear, hopefully engaging, and definitely impartial understanding of what's happening.
Right, illuminating the dynamics, the motivations, the strategies, and, those ripple effects we talked about.
We want you to finish listening feeling genuinely informed, not just buried under information, and maybe have a better handle on what it means to be living through times like these.
Exactly. It's about giving you that context, helping you connect the dots between the headlines you see every day, so you're not just reacting to them one by one.
We're going to peel back the layers, understand why this conflict, which might seem like a sudden explosion, is actually, well, just the latest chapter in a very, very long story.
A story with centuries of shared history, believe it or not, followed by decades of just escalating tension. That's what brought us here.
The long shadow historical foundations of a modern conflict.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. The current situation, this intensity we're seeing, it really didn't just appear overnight, did it?
Not at all. To really get why things are so serious now, why the motivations are what they are, you absolutely have to look back. This isn't some sudden flashpoint.
It's the latest phase, maybe the most dangerous one, in a relationship that's been evolving and getting pretty strained for a long time.
And what's really fascinating and maybe surprising to some people is just how far back those roots go. We're talking over 2,700 years of Jewish presence in Persia, ancient Iran.
2,700 years, that's incredible.
It is. It's a profound historical connection, not just some minor detail. Think about someone like Cyrus the Great, way back late 6th century BC.
Okay.
The Bible, books like Ezra and Isaiah, they credit him with something pretty extraordinary. After he conquered Babylon, he actually allowed the Jewish people who had been exiled there to go back to Jerusalem.
He let them go back.
Yeah, and even helped them rebuild their temple. This wasn't just him being nice, it was part of his whole policy. He was known for being tolerant of different cultures, religions within his empire, the Achaemenid Empire.
It sounds pretty radical for ancient times.
It really was, letting exiled people return home and worship freely. That was revolutionary then. And it stands in such stark contrast to how a lot of other ancient empires operated.
So that foundation, that history of, coexistence, even cooperation, that's really important context for understanding today.
Hugely important. It highlights this long period where the relationship was often positive, even mutually beneficial sometimes. It makes the modern tensions, which come from a totally different ideology, seem even more dramatic.
It really shows how much an ideological revolution can just completely reshape things, turning centuries of shared history into, enmity.
Precisely. Millennia of connection overturned.
So where was that turning point, that moment when millennia of coexistence just broke?
The big one, the fundamental shift, the rupture, really, happened after Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution.
Right, 1979.
Before that, Iran and Israel actually had this sort of pragmatic relationship. sometimes quiet, but driven by shared interests, like being suspicious of Arab nationalism. Iran was a close U.S. ally back then, remember?
I do, yeah.
But the revolution just completely changed Iran's direction, internally and externally. The new Islamic Republic, under Ayatollah Khomeini, adopted this fiercely anti-Western, anti-Zionist ideology.
So that was the break. From complex cooperation to outright hostility.
Absolutely, a complete departure from history. From that moment on, Iran's official policy has openly called for the destruction of Israel. They often call it the Zionist entity. It became a core objective.
Not just talk, but actual policy.
Embedded policy. It wasn't just rhetoric, it became a fundamental principle guiding their foreign policy, shaping pretty much every strategic move they've made in the region ever since.
And it's that huge ideological shift that really paved the way for the direct military clashes we're seeing now. That history makes these recent strikes feel even heavier, doesn't it?
It really does. It transforms what was mostly a proxy war, a shadow conflict, into something much more direct, much more dangerous, and something the whole world is watching.
Yeah, it's not shadowboxing anymore. It's a direct exchange of blows.
The escalation, direct strikes, and retaliation.
And that historical context brings us right up to the present day, the razor's edge, where these long simmering tensions have just erupted into this really dangerous new phase of direct confrontation.
Yeah, this is where it gets really intense.
Let's look at the immediate triggers, the things that just cranked up the tension and pushed us into this phase of direct strikes and counterstrikes. It feels like a massive departure from how things used to be, crossing a big red line.
It really was. And the recent escalation, it arguably kicked off with a very significant, kind of unprecedented move by former U.S. President Donald Trump.
What was that?
He ordered offensive strikes on 3 of Iran's most sensitive nuclear enrichment sites, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. He framed it as a clear warning, a show of force and intent.
Targeting the nuclear program directly. That's huge.
And the way they did it was significant, too. The scale, the precision. They used B-2 stealth bombers armed with GBU-57 bunker buster bombs.
Bunker busters, so designed for deep underground targets.
Exactly. These aren't just regular bombs. The GBU-57 is basically top of the line for hitting hardened, buried facilities. It signaled that the U.S. wasn't just trying to damage Iran's nuclear sites, but potentially eliminate the most protected parts of their infrastructure.
Wow. So the message was pretty blunt.
Very blunt. Trump's warning was stark. The bully of the Middle East must now make peace. There will either be peace or there will be tragedy for Iran. He even threatened more strikes with precision, speed, and skill if Iran retaliated. A very clear threat.
Okay, so a direct, powerful message backed by serious military tech hitting Iran where it hurts most strategically. How did Iran react? A regime that really values projecting strength.
Yeah.
How did they handle being hit like that?
Well, their immediate public response, through state media was kind of predictable. They tried to downplay it. Officials claimed they'd moved sensitive nuclear material beforehand, minimizing the damage.
Right, trying to save face.
Pretty much. But their foreign minister also condemned it, called it a barbaric violation of international law, asserted Iran's right to defend itself. Standard stuff. But the real response, the gut reaction, came fast.
That happened.
That same night, Iran launched a barrage of missiles directly at Israeli cities. Not through proxies, but a direct attack on Israeli territory. Analysts immediately called that a dangerous new stage in the conflict.
Because it broke the old rules.
Exactly. It shattered those unspoken rules of engagement that had mostly kept things in the shadows, fought through proxies. Iran showed it was willing to cross a line it hadn't crossed before.
And we've seen that cycle continue, haven't we? It wasn't just a one-off retaliation. It set a new, much riskier pattern.
Absolutely. The DIA report mentions Iran's follow-up direct responses. Like, in April 2024, they used about 300 missiles and UAVs drones in a direct attack on Israel.
300? That's a huge number.
It is. And then another big strike in October 2024, around 200 missiles. Iran claimed both times these were retaliation for attacks on its officials, alleged assassinations of key people.
Okay.
But what's really crucial here, and it gives you real insight into Iran's thinking, is the internal struggle they were facing during these exchanges. The regime was walking this incredibly fine line.
How so?
Well, on one hand, they felt they had to hit back to reestablish deterrence, show strength to their own hardliners, prove they wouldn't be attacked without consequence. But on the other hand, they had to manage the huge risk of escalating the conflict into a broader regional war.
A war they probably couldn't win conventionally against the U.S. and Israel combined.
Precisely. So it was this strategic tightrope walk. It wasn't just military calculation. It reflected a regime caught between needing to look tough and a pragmatic instinct for survival, knowing how catastrophic a full-scale war could be. Understanding that tension is key.
And just in the last few days, amidst all this back and forth, there have been reports about a potential ceasefire. A little bit of hope, maybe? What's the story there?
Yeah, that's a very recent and pretty intriguing development, a possible pause in the direct fighting. On June 23rd, 2025, President Trump announced a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. It seems Qatar helped mediate it.
Qatar stepping in again. So does this mean a real shift towards de-escalation?
Well, it certainly shows a desire for it, at least from the U.S. side, and presumably some openness from Israel for now. But context is important here. Right after those U.S. nuclear strikes, Iran did carry out a symbolic missile attack on the U.S. Al Udeid air base in Qatar.
Okay. Symbolic, but still an attack on a U.S. base.
Right. But what was really telling was Trump's immediate reaction. He indicated the U.S. would not respond to that specific attack, explicitly saying, "It is time for peace."
That sounds familiar. Didn't he do something similar before?
He did. Back in January 2020, after Iran hit the Ain al-Assad base in Iraq following the Soleimani killing, Trump also chose not to retaliate further. This pattern might suggest a U.S. approach of, let's say, strategic de-escalation in certain moments, even when provoked, maybe prioritizing stability over tit for tat.
Interesting. But the big question is whether that U.S. posture actually leads to lasting peace in the region itself.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Iran's strategic doctrine, asymmetric warfare, and nuclear ambitions.
So, okay, considering these reactions, this balancing act, this new ceasefire, what does it all tell us about Iran's overall strategy? They obviously have a unique way of operating, especially facing powerful enemies like Israel and the U.S. It's not just about tanks and planes, is it?
Not at all. And that raises a really important question. How does Iran, facing technologically superior forces, actually manage to project power, deter attacks, and chase its regional goals without sparking a full-blown conventional war they likely can't win?
Right. How do they do it?
Their strategy, which was really forged in the fires of the Iran-Iraq War back in the 80s and refined ever since the '79 revolution, leans heavily on asymmetric warfare.
Asymmetric warfare. Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. It's not just a tactic. It's more like a core philosophy for them. It involves actions that deliberately blur the lines between a clear military response and deniable covert operations. They call it forward deterrence.
Or deterrence.
Basically, they try to deter big attacks by making it clear that any aggression against them will be met with unpredictable, widespread, maybe painful responses, often through proxies or cyber attacks, making it really hard for an enemy to calculate the true costs of attacking them.
That sounds incredibly complicated, almost like fighting in the shadows. What kind of specific tactics are we talking about here?
It's a really broad playbook, and they're adaptable. Key tactics include giving massive support training, money, advanced weapons to proxy militias all over the region. Think Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis.
Yeah.
They also conduct pretty sophisticated cyber warfare, targeting critical infrastructure, military networks, and they've been known to orchestrate targeted killings or sabotage operations abroad, often designed so they can deny involvement.
And who carries this stuff out? Is there a specific group?
The main engine for this is the Quds Force. That's the covert sort of expeditionary wing of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. They run these secret networks in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, you name it, extending Iran's reach far beyond its borders.
So they're like Iran's external operations arm.
Exactly. And what's really striking and shows their resilience is that even after taking hits like recent Israeli strikes, losing key leaders, maybe even someone as high up as General Hossein Salami, reportedly the Quds Force infrastructure seems to stay functional. Their field commanders are trained to operate autonomously, to react quickly even if central command is disrupted. It means Iran can still, strike back or exert influence without officially taking credit. That deniability is crucial for them.
And this idea of operating through proxies, that links directly to what they call the axis of resistance, right? What exactly is that?
The axis of resistance is absolutely central to Iran's whole regional game plan. It's not just a random collection of allies. It's a deeply integrated network. It's an alliance of regional groups, mostly non-state actors, who share Iran's ideology opposing Israel, opposing U.S. influence.
So Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Right. Hezbollah, which is powerful militarily and politically. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Palestinian territories,
Hmm.
the Houthi movement in Yemen, who've shown they can really disrupt shipping.
And Iran backs them all.
Substantially.
Yeah.
Weapons, money,
Hmm.
training, it's ongoing and significant. And the strategic goal here, it's not necessarily about winning a conventional war against Israel. Iran knows its limits there.
So what is the goal then?
It's more about presenting Israel with a long-term existential challenge. An analyst at the Atlantic Council described it quite vividly as trying to slowly strangle Israel
Strangle them.
through a series of increasingly destructive, unwinnable wars. It's not about a knockout blow. It's about a war of attrition, draining Israel's resources, hurting its society, isolating it internationally by forcing it into these prolonged, costly fights with no clear end, a constant state of painful, low-grade conflict.
Wow. That's a grim long-term strategy. So, okay, that's the proxy network. But what about Iran's own direct capabilities, especially their nuclear program and missiles, particularly after those U.S. strikes? Where do things stand with their nuclear ambitions now?
Yeah, the nuclear program is still the elephant in the room, a huge global security concern. Even after the recent U.S. attacks, it's still dispersed across different sites, and importantly, it's still partially functional.
Partially functional.
There-
Meaning,
Well, while the IAEA, the International Nuclear Watchdog, and U.S. intelligence suggest Iran hasn't actively pursued building a bomb since maybe 2003, their uranium enrichment hasn't stopped. In fact, it's ramped up.
how much are they enriching?
They're enriching up to 60% purity. Now, that number might not sound dramatic, but it's critical. You need about 90% for a weapon, but 60% is way, way beyond the roughly 3–4% needed for civilian power plants.
So 60% is dangerously close.
It drastically shortens the breakout time. That's the time it would take them to sprint from where they are now to having enough weapons-grade material for a bomb. Reaching 60% makes that sprint much, much faster, which obviously sets off huge alarms internationally.
So the U.S. strikes didn't end the program.
Experts say strikes like those can delay things, maybe set them back, but they can't just erase the capability. The knowledge is there. A lot of the infrastructure remains. The ISW report did confirm very significant damage at the Fordo site, which is buried deep underground. But the report also mentioned the worrying possibility that Iran might have moved some of its most critical nuclear material to secret locations before the strikes. So it's really hard to know if you've truly crippled the program.
And Iran still says it wants to stay in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT.
Yeah, they've stated their intention to remain in the NPT, which is supposed to commit them to peaceful use. It's a complex signal, right? Staying in the treaty while pushing enrichment levels closer and closer to weapons grade.
What about their missiles and drones? Are those still a major focus for them?
Absolutely. That's a top priority for their own military development. Iran's clearly investing heavily in improving the range, accuracy, lethality, and reliability of its missiles and UAVs.
Why'd the focus there?
Because that's where they can compete better. They can't match Israel or the U.S. in conventional air power, so missiles and drones are their main tools for deterrence and retaliation. They have the largest and most diverse missile arsenal in the Middle East.
And didn't you mention something about space launches?
Yeah, that's another significant point. Over the last few years, they've really expanded their military space program, apparently with some help from Russia.
Why is that worrying?
Because the technology used to launch satellites into orbit is fundamentally very similar to the technology needed for intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. If they master that tech for space, it could potentially shorten their path to building an ICBM capable of reaching far beyond the region, maybe even the U.S. That would be a game changer.
And cyber attacks, too.
Definitely. The DIA report points to a big increase in cyber attacks, cyber spying, and information warfare coming from Iran, targeting Israel. It's another layer in their asymmetric toolkit. This multi-pronged approach lets them apply pressure on many fronts without necessarily risking a big conventional war they might lose.
Israel's counter-strategy and defensive posture.
Okay, so that's Iran's complex strategy. Now, let's flip the coin. Israel obviously has its own approach. It seems characterized by, well, precision, speed, and a very clear idea of what they want to achieve against these threats.
Absolutely. And what's really striking, I think, is the confidence and, frankly, the effectiveness Israel demonstrates, especially given the kind of multifaceted threat Iran poses. The Atlantic Council analysis suggests Israel's military and intelligence edge has managed to overwhelm and severely weaken the Iranian regime. They talk about decapitations, taking out key leaders, degrading Iran's armed forces, and damaging the nuclear program. It points to this surgical and lethal precision in their operations.
Surgical precision,
Yeah.
suggesting they have very good intelligence and targeting.
Exactly, a level that Iran seemingly can't match. It's a strategy designed not just to hit back, but to proactively dismantle Iranian capabilities and deter future attacks.
So Israel isn't just reacting, they're actively going after specific goals. What are those aims, especially regarding the nuclear program?
Before this recent ceasefire, Israeli defense officials were very upfront about their plans. They said they intended to increase strikes to rapidly achieve its war aims, and the main aim, to degrade, destroy, and remove the threat of Iran actually weaponizing its nuclear program.
Not just slow it down, but eliminate the threat.
That's the stated goal. Prime Minister Netanyahu even said Israel was very, very close to achieving these aims, and that they were working through a specific list of Iranian military targets. It sounds very methodical.
And they said they'd keep going if Iran attacked again.
Yes, or even if Israel just saw Iran trying to reconstitute its nuclear military strength. That's a very proactive stance, isn't it? It means they reserve the right to strike based on their intelligence, even if Iran hasn't attacked yet, if they think they're preparing something.
That's a powerful statement of intent. Can you give some examples of the kinds of targets Israel hit inside Iran besides the big nuclear sites? What does that tell us about their strategy?
Yeah, the ISW report gave some specifics that are quite revealing. They didn't just hit nuclear facilities. They struck IRGC ground forces provincial units in key areas like Kuraj, Alborz, near Tehran. Specific units like the Sayyid al-Shahada and Muhammad Rasul Allah units.
Okay, provincial ground force units. Why target those?
Well, these units have a dual role. Yes, they defend against external threats, but crucially, they're also responsible for suppressing internal dissent, maintaining regime control within Iran. So hitting them isn't just about weakening the military, it could also be aimed at undermining the regime's grip on its own people, creating internal pressure. And they also hit something called the Law Enforcement Command, or LEC, Information Security Command, in northern Tehran. The LEC is basically Iran's main internal security and police force. This specific command deals with intelligence, cyber defense, keeping tabs on dissent.
So hitting them is hitting the regime's internal control.
Exactly. It's an attack on their surveillance, control, and intelligence mechanisms. These target choices suggest a strategy that goes beyond just the nuclear program or external military power. It seems aimed at degrading the regime's internal stability too, potentially weakening it from within, a multi-pronged approach.
And what about Israel's own defenses? We talked about Iran launching hundreds of missiles and drones. How well can Israel defend against that kind of barrage?
Israel relies heavily on its really sophisticated, multi-layered missile defense system. You've probably heard of Iron Dome for short-range rockets.
Yeah.
Then there's David Sling for medium-range stuff, and the Arrow system for long-range ballistic missiles. Together, they create a pretty formidable shield, and they performed well against those big Iranian attacks in April and October.
But is there a limit? Can they sustain that?
That's the key challenge the DIA report points out: managing the stockpile of interceptor missiles. These interceptors are incredibly effective, but they're also very expensive, and they don't have an infinite supply.
Right.
So during sustained, heavy attacks, like hundreds of incoming threats at once, there's a real risk of running low on interceptors. It means prolonged, intense barrages could seriously strain their defenses, even for a country as advanced as Israel. That puts pressure on them to either achieve their goals quickly or make sure they have reliable resupply lines.
Okay, looking long-term then. Beyond stopping the immediate missile threat or degrading the nuclear program right now, what's Israel's ultimate goal regarding Iran? Is it just the nuclear program, or is there something bigger, maybe even regime change?
The number one goal, the overriding objective, seems to be crippling Iran's nuclear program so badly that Tehran simply cannot rebuild it quickly or make a dash for a bomb for the foreseeable future. It's about ensuring a long-term setback, maybe even a permanent one.
But does it stop there?
It seems the agenda might be broader. When Netanyahu was asked directly about regime change, his response was interesting. He said it could be the result of Israel's actions. He attributed this possibility to the Iranian regime being very weak and facing internal problems.
So maybe not the explicit goal, but a potential, maybe even welcome side effect.
That's how it sounds. And there are indications Israel's strategy might expand beyond just nuclear and military sites, potentially targeting Iran's energy infrastructure, which funds the regime, or even government buildings in Tehran. Officials have said there are many more targets left.
Wow. That suggests a really comprehensive campaign aimed at putting maximum pressure on the Iranian state across the board: military, economy, internal stability.
Global ripple effects and major power dynamics.
This whole situation, it's clearly not just about Iran and Israel, is it? The global stakes feel enormous. These events send ripples everywhere, affecting global oil markets, shaking up international alliances, influencing how big powers like the US, Russia, and China interact.
You're absolutely right. The interconnectedness is huge. And one of the biggest, most immediate global risks, the thing that keeps oil markets on edge, is the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, that narrow waterway. Why is it so critical?
Its location is everything. It's incredibly narrow, only about 33 kilometers wide at its choke point, but something like 20% of the entire world's daily oil supply has to pass through it.
20% through that tiny gap.
Yeah. And Iran has always seen it as a major leverage point, a strategic pressure point they can squeeze in a crisis. They've threatened many times to mine it or use their fast boats and shore-based missiles to block shipping, basically choke off global oil flow.
And if they did that, even for a short time, the impact would be massive, wouldn't it? More than just higher gas prices.
Oh, absolutely. Any major disruption there would send oil prices through the roof almost instantly. It could easily trigger a global energy crisis, send shockwaves through financial markets worldwide. We saw a taste of this during the Iran-Iraq tanker war in the 80s. Attacks on shipping then were intense, caused huge economic ripples.
But would Iran actually do it? Permanently close the strait?
Well, an expert from the Atlantic Council pointed out that while Iran could definitely disrupt it temporarily, it's extremely unlikely they'd shut it down permanently.
Why not? If it gives them so much leverage.
Because Iran needs to export its own oil, too.
Yeah.
To fund the government, pay the military, keep the economy afloat. Permanently closing the strait would be like cutting off their own lifeline. So while temporary disruptions, scary price spikes, massive global anxiety, those are very real risks. But a permanent closure, less likely. That tension, Iran's ability to threaten versus its need to trade, makes the strait a really volatile indicator of regional tension.
Okay, so beyond the economy and choke points, how are the big global players, Russia, China, positioning themselves in all this? Especially in relation to the U.S., it feels like a complex game of chess.
It really is. And the DIA report sheds some important light here. Take Russia. They're actively working with Iran, mainly to help Iran deal with its own diplomatic isolation and sanctions, especially those related to the Ukraine war.
And what does Iran get out of it?
Iran is using its sale of things Russia needs, like UAVs and missiles for the war in Ukraine, as leverage. Leverage to get advanced military tech from Russia. Things like modern Su-35 fighter jets help with their space launch program. Remember the ICBM connection?
Right, the dual-use stack.
Exactly. And for Russia, this fits into Putin's broader view of an existential struggle with the West over Ukraine. While they want to avoid a direct clash with NATO, they're good at asymmetric stuff, cyber, info ops, and they have their nuclear forces. Plus, Russia's trying hard to expand its global influence everywhere, strengthening ties with countries in the global south, even the Taliban, seeking new military bases worldwide, all to challenge the current global order and push back against the U.S.
And China. They always seem to tread carefully.
Very carefully, but strategically. China's deepening its partnership with Russia, but at the same time, they're trying hard to avoid doing anything too obvious, like sending weapons that could trigger Western sanctions or damage their reputation and economy.
So, quiet support.
More like diplomatic cover. China often legitimizes Russia's actions in international forums, the UN, BRICS, ASEAN giving them a shield. Meanwhile, China's laser-focused on its own military modernization, with big goals for 2027 and 2035. They want to project power, potentially take Taiwan, push the U.S. out of the Indo-Pacific.
How are they doing that?
By advancing quickly in space, cyber, and massively building up their missile stockpiles. Plus, they're building logistics hubs and bases overseas, which the DIA warns could threaten U.S. global operations or international commerce during a conflict. It adds another layer of complexity to global security.
So with Russia and China making these moves, how does that affect U.S. allies in the Middle East? Are they sticking close to the U.S. or looking elsewhere?
It's causing shifts. Some regional U.S. partners are increasingly reaching out to China and Russia as alternative security partners. It's basically hedging their bets.
Hedging? Why?
Because some perceive the U.S. as maybe disengaging a bit or becoming less reliable in the Middle East, so they're diversifying their relationships. But ironically, many of these same Arab partners are also talking directly to Iran, trying to engage them diplomatically and economically.
Engaging Iran, even with all the tension.
Yeah, despite the deep distrust. The hope is that engagement might deter Iran or its proxies from attacking their countries directly. It creates this incredibly complex web of shifting alliances, hedging, cautious engagement. Makes the whole region even harder to predict.
And one last really concerning ripple effect, the terrorism link. How is this Iran-Israel conflict affecting groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda?
The DIA report highlights this as a major concern. These groups, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, are opportunists. They're actively exploiting the Israel-Hamas conflict and the broader Iran-Israel tensions to boost their own cause.
Wow.
They use it to rally their global networks, recruit new members, raise money, and inspire or even directly enable attacks. Their targets, pretty much anyone they see as the enemy, U.S., Israeli, Jewish, European interests around the world. They're also trying to get better weapons, using easily available commercial tech like drones, maybe even exploring AI to become more lethal.
So a regional conflict fuels global terror threats.
Exactly. It shows how interconnected these threats really are. A conflict that seems localized can have direct security implications for people and countries thousands of miles away.
The human dimension: propaganda, public response, and individual perspective.
Okay, we've talked strategy, geopolitics, missiles. But behind all that, behind the headlines and the military maneuvers, there are actual people, aren't there? People caught up in this. What's it like for them? And maybe more personally for our listeners, for you listening now, maybe someone who just wants peace but feels constantly bombarded by this stuff. What does it all mean for you as an individual trying to make sense of it?
That's such a crucial point, and it often gets lost in the purely strategic talk. If you look at it from Iran's side, the state pumps out this constant stream of ideology aimed at its own people and the world.
What kind of message?
You hear it consistently from leaders at all levels. Supreme leaders like Khamenei and Raisi, past presidents, military commanders like Salami, Shirazi, Fadavi. They consistently call for the destruction of Israel. They say its obliteration is certain. The language is incredibly strong, unwavering, almost apocalyptic sometimes. It's designed to reinforce a core belief of the Islamic Republic.
And it's not just direct threats, is it? There's a whole narrative built around it.
Oh, yeah. Iranian state media pushes out all sorts of conspiracy theories to back this up, to demonize Israel completely. Like the idea that Israel wasn't formed naturally, but was deliberately created by the West just to stop Muslims from uniting. Or claims that Zionism is somehow responsible for the enslavement of the world's peoples, linking it to basically every problem imaginable. There are even these really bizarre offensive claims, like Mossad trying to undermine Shiite religious rituals by training Israelis to infiltrate mourning ceremonies. It's wild stuff.
So they link Zionism to everything from SARS to Hollywood.
Pretty much anything they can. It's a pervasive propaganda effort designed to control how people think, paint the enemy as pure evil, and justify the regime's hostile stance by framing it as this grand existential struggle.
That's a really stark picture of the official line. But what about the actual Iranian people? How are they reacting? Is everyone just marching in lockstep with the regime on this?
That's where it gets much more complicated, and you see a big disconnect, according to the Atlantic Council's analysis. Yes, the regime supporters, they're outraged by the strikes on Iran, they back retaliation, but the analysis suggests they're actually a small minority of the population.
Really? So most Iranians don't support the regime's stance?
The report suggests most Iranians at this point oppose their regime, and apparently there's little love lost for the IRGC leaders whom Israel killed. People might see them more as tools of internal repression, not national heroes.
Interesting. So sympathy lies elsewhere.
Crucially, many Iranians expressed real sorrow for the innocent civilians killed in the Israeli strikes, especially when residential buildings in Tehran were hit. There's a basic human empathy there that cuts across the political lines.
And the history of war must play a role, too.
Definitely. For Iranians who remember the devastating Iran-Iraq War in the 80s, these current strikes bring back terrible memories of bombs falling on Tehran. It's a deep collective trauma, and it makes people very wary of another large-scale war.
So a complex picture. What about normalizing relations?
Well, some polling cited by Wikipedia is interesting. It suggests that while many Iranians might actually support normalizing relations with the U.S., a large majority, like 67%, still reject normalizing relations with Israel. So it's not a simple picture. Public opinion is nuanced, often differs sharply from the official propaganda, and seems to prioritize stability over confrontation.
Okay, so bringing it back to the listener, if you're hearing all this, the long history, the strategies, the global impacts, the human cost, and you're just feeling small, overwhelmed by it all, what does it actually mean for you? How do we navigate this stuff, especially if we just want peace but feel exposed to these conflicts?
It's a totally valid feeling, and it gets to the heart of why understanding this, even if it feels remote, is so important. We're not talking about you personally intervening in a war, obviously. That's impossible.
Right.
What we are talking about is the power of informed understanding. by getting a handle on the history, the motivations, the strategies like asymmetric warfare or cyber attacks, the ripple effects. By understanding all that, you as an individual gain some really crucial tools.
Like what? How does understanding help?
First, you can start to cut through the noise.
Mhm.
There's so much information, disinformation, propaganda flying around. Being informed helps you spot the difference, filter out the noise, become a more resilient news consumer.
Okay, makes sense. What else?
Second, you can critically assess things better. You can question the assumptions behind headlines, look for biases, consider different viewpoints, instead of just accepting one story. It empowers you to form your own judgment.
Right, think for yourself more.
Third, you can understand the implications. You start to see how a conflict far away can actually impact things closer to home, global trade, oil prices, maybe even security, through things like terrorism narratives spreading online. You see the connections.
And maybe the most important part.
Perhaps. Informed understanding allows you to empathize. It helps you see the real human cost, the experiences of ordinary people caught in the middle. And recognizing that shared humanity reinforces why seeking peace and understanding is so vital.
So this deep dive, it's really about equipping listeners.
Exactly. Equipping you with the knowledge to be more discerning, more resilient, more engaged in a world overflowing with information. It turns that feeling of helplessness into a more powerful, informed awareness. You become an active participant in understanding the world, not just a passive recipient of bad news.
What comes next? Paths and wildcards.
This has been incredibly comprehensive. We've really dug deep into the Iran-Israel conflict today. So, as we wrapped up, the big question is hanging there.
Hmm?
Where do things go from here? Is this ceasefire we mentioned just a temporary pause, or could it be a real shift? The stakes, as we've laid out, are just incredibly high for everyone. For those of us watching this unfold, the future feels very uncertain.
Yeah, the ceasefire announced by President Trump, brokered by Qatar, it's definitely significant. It offers a much-needed pause. But we have to be realistic about how fragile it might be.
Fragile how?
Well, remember, just before this, Israeli officials were saying very clearly they planned to keep hitting targets until their goals were met. And they specifically said they'd start again if Iran attacked, or even if Israel just thought Iran was trying to reconstitute its capabilities.
So the underlying issues haven't gone away.
Not at all. That implies this deep tension is still there, just under the surface. Israel seems ready to act again if needed. So while the direct fighting might have paused, the fundamental strategic goals on both sides likely haven't changed.
Which means the risk of things flaring up again is still very real. It sounds more like a timeout than a resolution.
I think that's a fair assessment. The Atlantic Council described the stakes as sky high, making a lasting peace deal hard to engineer given how deep the distrust and strategic differences run.
And Israel still feels it has unfinished business.
They've said they have many more targets left. Their stated goal is to damage Iran's nuclear program so badly it can't recover or make a dash for a weapon for the foreseeable future. That kind of goal implies sustained pressure might be needed.
And what about Iran? What are their pressures?
Iran faces huge internal pressure, too. The regime feels it has to keep showing it can hit back, that it can inflict punishment on Israel, otherwise it risks losing face with its own hardline supporters, which could potentially spark serious unrest.
So both sides have reasons to potentially resume hostilities.
It creates this powerful, almost self-perpetuating dynamic, pushing them towards maintaining leverage, staying ready, and possibly clashing again.
And what about the wild card, U.S. policy? How much does President Trump's approach shape what happens next? He seems capable of both dramatic action and sudden de-escalation.
The U.S. president's role here, especially Trump in this scenario, is absolutely a wild card. His choices will heavily shape the path forward. We saw the decisive action with the bunker buster strikes, but also the strategic restraint after the Al Udeid attack.
So what might he do now? Let them fight or push for talks?
That's the key question. Will he decide to basically let the two sides fight it out, step back a bit, or will he actively lean on Israel to ease up on attacks and push Iran back towards nuclear negotiations?
What do his past actions suggest?
His actions often seem driven by what he sees as pragmatic de-escalation that aligns with his America First idea, avoiding long entanglements. But this situation is incredibly complex. Getting a nuclear deal where Iran gives up enrichment entirely seems very unlikely. That's a red line for them.
So this conflict isn't going away anytime soon.
It seems almost certain to dominate Trump's Middle East agenda for the foreseeable future. It'll remain a major global concern, affecting regional stability and more. And the DIA adds another interesting point. They assess that this constant threat of direct attack might actually push Iran to change its whole military strategy.
How so?
It might compel Iran to shift from being mostly reactive, hitting back after being hit, to becoming more proactive, trying to deter a full-scale war by taking the initiative more often.
What would that look like?
Maybe more aggressive cyber operations, more preemptive covert actions abroad, maybe even using its proxy network to start conflicts rather than just responding. That would fundamentally change the risks for Israel and the US, a much more dangerous game.
Outro. Well, we have certainly taken a deep dive today, navigating the really complex, often unsettling, but incredibly important landscape of the Iran-Israel conflict. We traced it from its deep historical roots, stretching back centuries, and saw how that history shifted dramatically after Iran's 1979 revolution.
Yeah. Then we jumped into the immediate triggers, those direct U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear sites, Iran's swift retaliation against Israel, and this whole dangerous dance of deterrence and escalation that marks this new phase.
We really tried to unpack Iran's unique strategy, their reliance on asymmetric warfare, the axis of resistance proxy network, their ongoing nuclear and missile goals. And we contrasted that with Israel's approach, the focus on precision strikes, degrading Iran's capabilities, and pursuing some potentially very far-reaching objectives.
And we couldn't ignore those global ripples, could we? The critical Strait of Hormuz, the complex roles of Russia and China, even how terrorist groups are trying to exploit the situation.
And importantly, we brought it back to the human level, the propaganda, the real public responses inside Iran, reminding ourselves there are people living through this history.
It's definitely not a simple story, is it? No easy answers here, and it's certainly not just a local issue. It's multi-layered, constantly evolving, with consequences for the whole world. We really hope that by laying out these different layers, you listening feel a bit more equipped.
Yeah, equipped to understand the news you hear, maybe see behind the headlines a bit, grasp the forces at play.
And that brings us to maybe one last thought for you to mull over, especially for those of us who want peace but feel caught in the middle of these global storms. In a world where these geopolitical lines shift so fast, where technology keeps changing how conflicts are fought, what responsibility do we have, just as informed individuals, in understanding these complex events, maybe even in shaping the narratives around them?
It's a big question. No easy answer there either. But we really encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep engaging with the world. Because knowing more, understanding more, that's where real resilience comes from.
Absolutely. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.